The gathering storm. The late afternoon sun, typically a golden caress in the meadowsweet foothills, had curdled to a bruised purple. Ilara, her brow a landscape of concentration and burgeoning unease, snapped the stalk of a plump moon petal. Its silvery leaves, usually luminous even by day, now appeared dull, leached of life beneath the oppressive sky. Her woven basket, already half laden with crucial herbs, crimson root for fevers, sun blossom for aches, and a generous tuft of whispering mint to soothe troubled minds, felt unusually heavy. It wasn't just the botanical bounty, it was the air itself, thick and humid, clinging to her skin like an unwelcome shroud. A low, guttural growl vibrated up through the soles of her worn boots. Ilara's head shot up, her heart giving an involuntary lurch. This wasn't the familiar rumble of mountain bears or the distant bellow of a wild stag. This sound was deeper, more ancient, a primal warning that resonated in her very bones. Above the jagged teeth of the dragon's tooth range, the sky, usually a brilliant azure, now swirled with charcoal and ash. A cold gust, smelling of damp earth and something metallic, whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. "Grandmother will worry," she murmured, her voice a fragile whisper against the rising wind. She tightened her grip on the basket, knuckles stark white. Her grandmother, with eyes as keen as her sense for brewing storms, had cautioned her against venturing too far up the slope today. But the rare silver bell, essential for an old cough, bloomed only near the highest springs, and Ilara had been resolute in her quest. Now, clutching a small sprig of its delicate, bell-shaped flowers, she regretted her stubbornness. The first fat drop of rain splattered on her cheek, shockingly cold, then another, then a cascade, quickly blossoming into a steady patter across the broad forest leaves. Ilara broke into a run, her normally graceful movements becoming clumsy and desperate. The path, little more than a deer trail, was already slick with moisture. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles, now carried the sharp tang of ozone. Another boom, closer this time, rattled the very stones beneath her feet. Lightning, a jagged white scar, tore across the darkening heavens, illuminating the craggy peaks for a terrifying instant. Ilara gasped, stumbling. The rain was no longer a patter. It was a relentless deluge, soaking through her homespun tunic in seconds, her hair plastered to her face, stinging her eyes. The basket, suddenly precarious, threatened to slip. "Shelter!" she panted, breath coming in ragged gasps. "I need shelter." Her gaze darted desperately. The dense canopy of ancient firs offered scant protection against this downpour. To her left, the mountain face rose steeply, a sheer wall of rock. To her right, the ground plunged sharply into a ravine, now obscured by sheets of rain. No caves, no overhangs, no familiar hunters' lean-tos offered refuge in this exposed stretch. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at her resolve. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, conjuring the warm glow of her hearth, the comforting aroma of her grandmother's stew. It spurred her onward. A flash of dark wood, almost imperceptible in the fading light and driving rain, snagged her attention. Further down the path, where the trail widened slightly before a sharp bend, something large and unnatural stood partially concealed by a cluster of ancient oaks. It looked like a carriage, impossibly grand for this remote mountain pass, its dark, polished surface gleaming dully under the deluge. Utterly still, it seemed abandoned. Hesitation warred with instinct. A strange carriage, left out in a storm, surely portended ill. But the rain was turning to icy needles, and the thunder had become a continuous, deafening roar. Her fingers were numb, her teeth chattering. The thought of an empty, albeit unusual haven was too tempting to resist. With a final surge of adrenaline, Ilara sprinted towards it, The basket clutched tight to her chest. The ground beneath her feet dissolved into a muddy quagmire, each step a struggle. She reached the carriage, a magnificent, imposing vehicle, far grander than any she had ever seen, its intricate carvings barely visible through the sheeting water. It was silent, ominous, yet in that moment, it was her only hope. She reached for the ornate handle of the carriage door, her fingers fumbling, praying it wasn't locked. An unexpected refuge. The silver bell, once her sole focus, was long forgotten. Now Ilara's world had narrowed to the deafening roar of the wind and the icy needles of rain lashing her skin. Each step was a treacherous dance on the slick, leaf-strewn ground. The growl closer now, a guttural vibration that resonated in her bones, spurred her on with a fresh surge of terror. Her breath hitched in her throat, a ragged gasp for air that felt thin and sharp. Then, through a momentary lull in the driving rain, a dark, imposing silhouette emerged from the swirling mists of the forest. It wasn't a natural rock formation or a fallen tree. As she stumbled closer, pushing aside a curtain of dripping branches, its shape sharpened into something undeniably man-made, yet startlingly out of place in the wild, untamed mountainside. It was a carriage. Not just any carriage, but a magnificent, obsidian-black behemoth, its lacquered surface gleaming even under the oppressive sky. Ornate gold filigree, intricate and swirling, adorned its panels, catching the faint, bruised light. A coat of arms, she dimly registered, was emblazoned on its heavy door, a snarling wolf's head beneath the crown, though her eyes were too blurred by rain and fear to make out the finer details. This was no common traveller's conveyance. This was a royal carriage, abandoned and decaying, yet still radiating an aura of austere grandeur. A flicker of hope, fragile but insistent, ignited within her. Abandoned, empty, safe. With newfound resolve, Ilara half ran, half slid towards it, her sodden cloak heavy against her. The wind howled like a banshee, threatening to rip her from her feet. The branches whipped around her, snagging at her clothes and hair. She reached the carriage, her trembling fingers fumbling for the heavy, gold-plated handle. It was cold beneath her touch, slick with rain. She pulled, straining against its weight, her muscles screaming in protest. With a groan of protesting wood and metal, the door gave way, swinging inward just enough to reveal a cavernous, velvety darkness within. A wave of stale, earthy air mingled with the faint scent of old leather and something vaguely metallic wafted out. But it was dry. Oh, so blissfully dry. "Thank the spirits," she gasped, the words stolen by the wind as soon as they left her lips. She scrambled inside, her movements clumsy, propelled by an urgent need for shelter. The space was surprisingly wide, padded with deep, plush velvet seats that looked as if they had once been a rich crimson, now faded to a muted burgundy. Rain-streaked light from the open door briefly illuminated the interior, revealing dust motes dancing in the air and a thick layer of grime on the polished wood. But it was shelter, and in that moment, it was everything. She squeezed through the narrow opening, turning to pull the door shut behind her. The heavy thud resonated through the carriage, a sound of finality that momentarily drowned out the storm's fury. Darkness enveloped her, thick and immediate, broken only by slivers of light filtering through the small, grimy windows that seemed to be set too high to see out of easily. For a beat, a precious, stolen beat, Ilara allowed herself to sag against the closed door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence, relative though it was, felt like a balm to her frayed nerves. The terrifying growl was gone, swallowed by the thick walls of the carriage. The biting wind no longer clawed at her. The deluge no longer soaked her to the bone. She was safe, alone. Or so she thought. As her eyes began to adjust to the gloom, a subtle shift in the air, a faint warmth radiating from the opposite side of the carriage, sent a prickle of unease down her spine. A distinct, deep inhale, followed by a slow, measured exhale, broke the fragile silence. Elara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The warmth intensified, a living presence. The air in the carriage, once merely stale, now felt suddenly charged, heavy with an unspoken awareness. She was not alone, locked in. A violent gust of wind, a roaring beast against the mountain's flank, slammed the heavy carriage door shut. The sound was a deafening crack, echoing the thunder that had just rolled overhead. Elara flinched, her heart leaping into her throat, only for it to plummet further when a solid, metallic thunk and a distinct click announced the locking mechanism had engaged. Trapped, utterly, irrevocably trapped. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. She fumbled desperately for the handle, her fingers slick against the ornate brass. But it was useless. The darkness inside was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed in from all sides, amplifying the drumming rain against the roof and the unseen presence she now knew was there. Her breath hitched, a strangled gasp catching in her throat. "Who are you?" The voice was deep, resonant, a rumble that vibrated through the carriage's very timbers, startling Elara so profoundly she nearly cried out. It wasn't the snarl of a beast, but something far more unnerving. Human. And male. A wave of goosebumps erupted across her skin, prickling from her scalp to her fingertips. Her mind, already frayed by the storm and the mysterious growl, struggled to process this new threat. She pressed herself back against the plush velvet seat, trying to melt into its shadows, though she knew it was futile. I didn't mean to intrude," Elara stammered, her voice a reedy whisper against the storm's fury. "The storm... I just needed shelter. The door was open." She hated how pathetic she sounded, how fear had stripped her of all composure. A beat of silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and unseen judgment. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. She could feel eyes on her. A heavy, assessing gaze in the impenetrable gloom. The carriage swayed violently with another windlash, throwing Elara slightly off balance. Then, a sudden blinding flash. A jagged bolt of lightning ripped across the sky, momentarily illuminating the carriage's interior with an ethereal bluish-white glow. In that fleeting instant, Elara saw him. He sat opposite her, an imposing figure even in a seated position. His face, illuminated for less than a second, was stern, chiseled, framed by dark, wet hair that clung to his forehead, high cheekbones, a strong jawline, and eyes. She caught a glimpse of their piercing intensity, though their colour remained a mystery. He wore a dark, heavy cloak, its hood now pushed back, revealing the regal cut of his tunic beneath. Despite the weariness etched around his mouth, there was an unmistakable air of authority, a quiet power that radiated from him like heat from a hearth. The lightning faded, plunging them back into profound darkness, but the image was seared into Elara's mind. A king. Or at least, someone of immense importance. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had stumbled not just into a royal carriage, but into the presence of royalty itself. And by the grim set of his features she'd glimpsed, he was clearly not pleased. "Explain yourself," the deep voice commanded, devoid of any warmth, "and be quick about it." Elara swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. The terror of the growl outside, the biting wind, all seemed trivial compared to the ice in his voice. She could feel his scrutiny even in the dark, a tangible weight. Her small lie about the door being open felt flimsy, transparent. She had to tell him the truth, or at least a version of it that wouldn't get her accused of treason. I was running from the storm. She began again, forcing herself to speak more clearly, less like a frightened mouse. And there was something else, a sound, a growl. I thought it was following me. This was the only shelter I could find. She paused, then added, I didn't know anyone was in here, I truly didn't. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. She could hear the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water seeping through a crack in the carriage roof, the only counterpoint to her own hammering heart. Had he believed her? Or did he think her an assassin, a spy, sent to ambush him in the desolate mountains? The implications were terrifying. Her quiet, ordinary life in the village felt 1,000,000 miles away, replaced by this sudden, perilous encounter. Another flash of lightning, not as bright this time, but enough to briefly illuminate his profile. He was looking out the window, his gaze fixed on the storm-swept landscape, his jaw tight. The brief glimpse confirmed her initial impression. This man carried a weight that went beyond the current tempest. He was King Theron Blackwood, the Alpha King himself. And she, Ilara Meadowsweet, was locked in a carriage with him, in the middle of a violent mountain storm, with no hope of escape until morning. The Alpha's wrath and realization. The words caught in Ilara's throat, a frantic flurry of excuses battling for dominance in her mind. Your Majesty, I didn't mean to. The storm, it was so sudden, and the carriage, it seemed empty. I was just looking for shelter, I swear. I didn't know anyone was in here. Her voice, thin and reedy, cracked on the last word, betraying the tremor that coursed through her. She clutched the rough fabric of her cloak, her knuckles white, her gaze darting between the king's unreadable face and the now shuttered window where the storm continued its relentless assault. Theron Blackwood's jaw was a granite slab, his dark eyes like chips of obsidian reflecting the dim light of the carriage. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the air, chilling Ilara to the bone. Empty? He bit out, the single word dripping with disdain. Do I look like a ghost girl? Do you take the Blackwood crest for a common vagrant's shelter? His voice, though not raised, held an icy authority that commanded absolute attention. Every muscle in his formidable frame seemed coiled, ready to strike. He truly was an alpha, radiating an aura of barely contained power and fury that made Ilara's instincts scream for flight. The carriage lurched violently, throwing Ilara against the plush, velvet seat opposite him. She gasped, a small cry escaping her lips as the world outside dissolved into a cacophony of howling wind and torrential rain. A particularly vicious gust rattled the carriage with such force that it felt as though it might splinter apart. Through the small gap in the heavy curtains, Ilara caught a terrifying glimpse of a tree branch, thick as a man's thigh, snapping under the storm's might. Theron, momentarily distracted by the carriage's sudden tilt, shifted his weight, his gaze flicking to the window. His expression, previously fixed in a mask of anger, subtly altered. The intensity remained, but a flicker of something else, concern, perhaps, or a dawning realization, crossed his features. He reached out, not to Ilara, but to the carriage door handle, testing it with a firm grip. It didn't budge. He tried again, harder this time, a grunt of effort escaping him. The latch remained stubbornly locked. "What in the blazes?" he muttered, abandoning the door to peer through the thick glass of the window, pressing his face close to the pane. The landscape outside was a swirling nightmare of blurred greys and greens, visibility almost zero. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof intensified, drowning out all other sounds. He turned back, his eyes narrowing, no longer solely focused on Ilara, but on their shared predicament. "We're stopped," he stated, his voice now lower, devoid of its previous sharp edge. "And we're not moving. The driver, the guards." He trailed off, his gaze sweeping over the confined space, then back to Alara, who sat huddled, watching him with wide, fearful eyes. The initial surge of fury had begun to recede, replaced by a grim acceptance. Another shuddering jolt rocked the carriage, sending a shiver through Alara. The deep rumble of distant thunder vibrated through the floorboards, a primal sound that echoed the king's earlier growl. Theron closed his eyes for a brief moment, a deep breath expanding his chest. When he opened them again, the royal ire had been replaced by a quiet, formidable resolve. He was still the Alpha King, but now his authority was directed at the situation, not solely at her. "It seems, girl," he said, his voice a low growl of finality, "that for the moment we are both rather thoroughly stranded." He leaned back against the plush seat, his powerful frame filling the space, his arms crossing over his chest. His eyes, though still intense, held a new, analytical glint. The storm outside raged, a powerful, impartial force that had stripped away the formalities of their stations and reduced them to two souls trapped together in a metal box, awaiting the dawn. Alara, despite her terror, felt a strange shift in the air, a subtle easing of the suffocating tension, replaced now by the heavy weight of their shared isolation. A tense silence. Outside the carriage, a maelstrom raged. The wind howled, a banshee tearing at ancient oaks that clawed back at the carriage's sturdy frame. Rain hammered relentlessly, a percussive assault threatening to dismantle their fragile sanctuary. Inside, the darkness was absolute, punctuated only by lightning's sporadic flicker, briefly illuminating ornate carvings before plunging them into deeper gloom. Alara huddled, knees drawn to her chest, her thin cloak a meager defense against the creeping chill. Her heart thrummed a frantic rhythm, each beat a stark reminder of her precarious situation. The initial shock of her predicament with the king had curdled into a gnawing fear, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Thunderclaps felt like a giant's fist, each gust of wind a threat to send them tumbling down the unseen precipice. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to conjure images of her cottage. A crackling hearth, the scent of lavender and dried herbs, but the storm was too insistent, too primal. A small, involuntary tremor racked her frame. It wasn't just the cold. The carriage had grown noticeably colder. It was the crushing weight of the unknown, the terrifying possibility of being stranded, or worse, succumbing to the elements. And then there was him, King Theron. He remained utterly still, a dark silhouette across from her. His features were lost in the oppressive blackness, yet his presence was a palpable weight in the confined space. He hadn't uttered a word since his grim pronouncement, but his silence was far from comforting, a watchful, dangerous quiet, the prelude to a predator's strike. Alara risked a glance, her breath catching. Was he even looking at her? She couldn't tell, yet the sensation of being observed was undeniable, a prickling awareness on her nape. She imagined his eyes, sharp and piercing even in the gloom, dissecting her. The thought sent another shiver through her. She was acutely aware of her disheveled state, damp clothes and likely mud-streaked face. A peasant, an intruder, in the presence of a king. The chasm between them felt vast, insurmountable. The storm raged on, an unyielding torrent of sound. Ilara's muscles ached from tension, her throat dry, her stomach a tight knot of apprehension. She longed to speak, to break the suffocating silence, a question, an apology, a plea. But the words died, choked by the terror of his potential reaction. What if he was still angry? What if he blamed her for their predicament, a storm's doing? Theron, for his part, remained impassive. His unseen gaze held an unwavering intensity. He noted the subtle tremble in her hands, the way she clutched her cloak, the slight hitch in her breath with each violent lurch. He observed the rise and fall of her chest, the fragile curve of her shoulders. Small, clearly terrified, yet she held herself with a quiet dignity, not cowering, but simply enduring. His initial irritation had long since receded, replaced by a cold, analytical assessment of their shared plight. The storm was a formidable adversary. Survival for now, the sole directive. And in this cramped, rocking carriage, this frightened young woman was an unexpected, unwelcome variable in that equation. He needed to understand her. Was she a liability, or something else entirely? Minutes bled into hours, marked only by the storm's unwavering ferocity. Ilara's eyelids grew heavy, but fear kept sleep at bay. Each stronger gust of wind buffeting the carriage, sending it swaying precariously, evoked a small gasp. Each time, Theron's unseen gaze seemed to intensify, a silent pressure in the impenetrable darkness. The only sounds were nature's raw power and the steady, unnerving rhythm of their shared breathing. A mountain melody. The carriage jolted again, throwing Ilara against the plush velvet seat. She bit back a whimper, the taste of blood blooming on her tongue. The wind outside howled like a banshee, each gust a physical blow against their fragile shelter. Rain hammered the roof, a relentless drumbeat that spoke of unending misery. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at her resolve. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to conjure the image of her grandmother's cozy cottage, the scent of wood smoke and lavender. It was a futile effort. The storm was too loud, too insistent. Her breath hitched. She needed something, anything to anchor herself. Without thinking, a soft, reedy hum escaped her lips. It was an old tune, passed down through generations of meadow sweets, a lullaby her grandmother would sing on the porch swing as the sun dipped behind the whispering peaks. The melody was simple, a meandering path of notes that spoke of rolling hills and babbling brooks, of quiet strength found in the heart of the mountains. She didn't open her eyes, didn't dare to look at the silent, formidable presence across from her. She just hummed, letting the familiar cadence weave a fragile shield around her fraying nerves. The rhythmic rocking of the carriage, combined with the gentle rise and fall of the tune, began to work its magic. The frantic beat of her heart slowed, replaced by the steady, comforting rhythm of the lullaby. She felt a subtle shift in the air, a minute alteration in the dense silence that had previously filled the space between them. That tune. A low voice cut through the storm's din, startling her. Ilara's eyes snapped open. Theron's gaze, previously fixed on the rain-streaked window, now rested on her. His expression was unreadable, a blend of surprise and something akin to curiosity. "I've never heard it before. What is it?" Ilara's cheeks flushed crimson. She hadn't realized she was audible, much less that he would take notice. It's just an old mountain song, Your Majesty," she stammered, her voice thin. "My grandmother used to sing it, to calm the little ones during storms." Theron's brow furrowed, a faint crease appearing between his dark brows. "A lullaby, then?" There was a hint of something softer in his tone, a departure from the cold authority she had grown accustomed to. She nodded, twisting her hands in her lap. "Yes, Your Majesty. It's called The Stone's Embrace. It speaks of the mountains protecting us, even in the fiercest blizzards." He regarded her, his gaze intense, as if trying to decipher a complex riddle. "You have a clear voice, peasant. Where did you learn such songs?" "From my grandmother, sir," Ilara replied, finding a sliver of courage in the unexpected turn of their conversation. She knew all the old tunes. We lived in a small village, just beyond the Blackwood Forest. Meadowsweet Hollow, we called it. Meadowsweet Hollow, Theron repeated, the name rolling off his tongue with a surprising softness. I've heard of it. A quiet place, I imagine, far from the concerns of the capital. A small, wistful smile touched Alara's lips. Very far, Your Majesty. We had a simple life. My family tends a small herb garden. We harvest wild berries in the summer and gather medicinal roots in the autumn. In the evenings, we'd sit by the hearth, and my grandmother would tell stories of the old ways, of the spirits of the forest and the strength of the mountains. She paused, suddenly realizing she was rambling. The king was accustomed to grand pronouncements and matters of state, not tales of humble village life. She braced herself for a dismissive remark, perhaps even a sharp reprimand for her presumption. Instead, Theron remained silent, his gaze still fixed on her. A flicker of something unidentifiable crossed his features, perhaps a fleeting memory or a distant thought. The rhythmic drumming of the rain continued. But for a moment, the storm outside seemed to recede, replaced by the quiet intimacy of their shared space. The lullaby, though no longer sung, still hung in the air, a fragile bridge between their disparate worlds. The burden of the crown. The lullaby's final note dissolved, leaving a stillness more profound than the storm's distant rumble. Theron's gaze, unreadable, flickered over Alara. He cleared his throat, a low rasp in the carriage's velvet confines. That melody, he began, his voice surprisingly gentle. It held a peculiar solace. A blush warmed Alara's cheeks. It's an old meadowsweet air, Your Majesty. My grandmother sang it to me. He nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as if viewing a landscape of memory beyond her. Solace is a luxury I seldom permit myself. He shifted, his broad frame brushing the plush velvet, a stark contrast to her coarse wool cloak. Do you comprehend, Alara, the sheer weight of a kingdom resting upon one's shoulders? The abrupt turn startled her. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the intricate embroidery of his tunic, avoiding his piercing stare. No, of course not. A sardonic twist touched his lips. You have your village, your kin. Simple joys, simple burdens. My burdens are altogether different. He leaned his head back, his eyelids briefly closing. Every decree, every hushed whisper in the court, every decision, it all funnels to me. The bounty of the harvest, the security of our borders, the very breath of my people. It's a relentless thrum within my mind, an unceasing pressure. Alara listened, a knot tightening in her stomach. She had always pictured the king's life as one of gilded ease, draped in deference and endless comfort. To hear it described as a crushing burden was disorienting. They observe the crown, he continued, his voice now lower, tinged with a weariness she hadn't previously registered. The formidable power, the majesty. They fail to see the man beneath, the man who sleeps sparingly, who trusts even less, the man who stands utterly alone, even amidst the grandest festivities. His eyes opened, and this time, when their gazes met, Alara saw not the imposing Alpha King, but a profound, aching solitude. You have your advisors, your royal guard, she ventured, her voice barely a breath. He let out a short, mirthless laugh. Advisors offer counsel, certainly, but the ultimate decision, and the ensuing blame if it falters, is invariably mine. The guard protects my person, yet who shields my heart? Who truly grasps the isolation inherent in this position? He gestured vaguely around the opulent carriage. This, he said, his voice laced with bitter irony, is my constant companion. A gilded cage, separating me from the very populace I am sworn to protect. Every smile, every utterance, every gesture is dissected, scrutinized for weakness, for advantage, there is no true confidant, no peer. The confession hung in the air, raw and heavy. Elara felt a surprising surge of empathy. She imagined a life where every interaction was a performance, every relationship tainted by the currents of power. It sounded suffocating. "My father," Theron continued, his voice softer still, almost a murmur, "once told me that the crown is a weight that reforges the wearer, stripping away the man and leaving only the monarch. I dismissed it then. Youthful arrogance, I suppose. Now," he paused, a long sigh escaping him, "now I comprehend. The man I was, the boy who once dreamt, is long gone, buried beneath centuries of tradition and expectation." He looked at her again, his eyes seeking something, understanding perhaps, or merely a silent acknowledgement of his pain. Elara, for her part, simply listened, her heart aching with a newfound compassion. She had never considered the king as a being with vulnerabilities, with fears and loneliness. He was a symbol, an unyielding force, but here, in the storm's dark embrace, he was merely a man, burdened beyond measure. "I confess," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind's howl, "I have never spoken of this to another living soul. Not to my council, not to my generals, not even to my own family." He met her gaze, a flicker of something akin to shame passing through his eyes before being replaced by a steely resolve. Perhaps it is the storm, perhaps the confinement, but there it is. Elara could only nod, a silent promise to guard his secret. This unexpected glimpse into the solitary world of the Alpha King. The chasm between them, once vast and defined by rank, had, for a fleeting moment, narrowed to a bridge forged of shared humanity and a startling, vulnerable truth. A healer's dream, the confession hung in the air, a fragile thread spun between them, made all the more delicate by the persistent drumming of rain on the carriage roof. Elara, still reeling from Theron's unexpected vulnerability, felt a shift within herself. The chasm between peasant and king had momentarily narrowed, replaced by a shared humanness that transcended their stations. His honesty, raw and unvarnished, sparked an answering courage in her. If he could lay bare his soul, perhaps she too could reveal a piece of her own. She swallowed. The dryness in her throat, a sudden reminder of the storm's chill and the lingering tension in the carriage. "My lord," she began, her voice a hesitant whisper against the storm's roar. I have a dream." The words felt foreign on her tongue, dreams being luxuries her life seldom afforded. Theron, who had been staring blankly at the carriage wall, turned his gaze to her. His expression was still heavy, but a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a hint of gentle encouragement, softened his stern features. "A dream," he echoed, his voice devoid of its usual royal command, softened by the earlier confidences. Elara nodded, finding a strange solace in his direct attention. It wasn't the judging stare of a king, but the steady gaze of a man who had just shown his own depths. "Yes, I've always wanted to be a healer." The admission felt liberating, a secret held close to her heart, finally given voice. She watched his reaction, half expecting amusement or dismissal, but he remained still, listening. "My grandmother, she knew so much about herbs, about setting bones, about easing fevers," Elara continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength as she spoke of the woman who had nurtured this aspiration. "I would watch her, learn from her. She taught me to identify the plants, to understand their properties, to listen to what the body was trying to say." A faint smile touched her lips. a wistful memory of sun-drenched meadows and the scent of crushed leaves. When I was little, I thought it was magic. She'd mix poultices, brew teas, and sometimes the pain would just lessen. The sickness would fade. The smile faded, replaced by a familiar ache of resignation. But magic it isn't. It's knowledge. And knowledge, true knowledge, costs. To become a proper healer, to truly help people, you need to apprentice. You need books, rare ingredients, a master to guide you. She gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the vast, invisible barrier that separated her from her dream. My family. We barely have enough for daily bread. There's no coin for such things. No coin for an apprenticeship. A sigh escaped her, weighted with years of suppressed longing. My mother always said it was a foolish fancy, that I should focus on finding a good husband, on tending our small plot of land. And she's right, of course. It's practical. It's what we do. But still, she trailed off, the unspoken "I still dream" hanging heavy between them. She looked at Theron, her gaze earnest and raw. It feels like a part of me, this desire to heal, to bring comfort, to mend what's broken. But it's a dream that will forever remain, just that. A dream. Because the world doesn't allow for such aspirations for someone like me. Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, a poignant blend of sorrow and a quiet, weary acceptance. The hopelessness of her situation was a familiar companion, but articulating it to him, to someone who could, theoretically, command the resources to make such a dream a reality, made it sting anew. The chasm between their worlds, momentarily bridged by shared vulnerability, yawned wide again, starkly illuminated by the contrast of their respective burdens. His, the weight of a crown; hers, the crushing burden of poverty. Theron remained silent for a long moment, the rhythmic patter of the rain the only sound. He didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to dismiss her feelings. He simply listened, his gaze unreadable, yet holding a depth of understanding Ilara hadn't expected. The faint smell of damp leather and old parchment filled the small space, a silent witness to the unlikely confidences exchanged. A hidden legacy. A sudden, deafening crack, impossibly close, ripped through the already raging storm. Before Ilara could even process the sound, the carriage lurched violently, heaving them sideways with a force that sent her slamming against the opposite wall. The king, with a guttural cry, braced himself, but even his formidable frame was momentarily unseated. A shriek of splintering wood followed, a sound far too intimate for comfort. The entire world seemed to tilt and groan, rain blasting in through a newly gouged aperture in the side panel. "What in blazes was that?" Theron roared, disentangling himself from a cascade of velvet and splintered oak. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "A tree, Your Majesty! It must have fallen against us." Her voice was thin, reedy, barely audible above the tempest's fury. She pointed a trembling finger at the gaping wound in the carriage wall. Through the jagged opening, the writhing branches of a fallen sentinel were visible, its bark stripped raw, its crown now a tangled mess against the deluge. Theron scrambled towards the damage, his face a mask of grim determination. He peered out, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of his sword, though what good a blade would do against a felled tree, Ilara couldn't fathom. As he pushed against a loose piece of timber to better assess the damage, a section of the inner panel, previously camouflaged by intricate carvings, gave way with a soft creak. It swung inward, revealing a small, dark cavity, both their eyes fixed on the unexpected void. The king's brow furrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing his stern features. He reached in, his fingers brushing against something solid, then withdrew a small, leather-bound volume. It was not a typical book, but rather a journal, its cover worn smooth from handling, its pages a faded cream. Dust motes, disturbed by its sudden liberation, danced in the dim light filtering through the storm-ravaged window. Ilara leaned closer, a natural curiosity overriding her fear. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Theron stared at the journal, his usual composure dissolving into a rare vulnerability. His fingers traced the intricate, almost forgotten sigil embossed on its cover, a delicate silver lily. His gaze was distant, lost in a memory Ilara could only guess at. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, a blend of shock and something akin to reverence. This belonged to my mother," he said, his voice rough, barely a murmur against the howling wind. "Queen Lyra. I haven't seen it since before she disappeared." Ilara's breath hitched. Queen Lyra, the ethereal, tragic queen who had vanished without a trace when Theron was a mere boy, leaving behind a kingdom shrouded in grief and a king consumed by a silent, lifelong sorrow. The stories of her beauty, her kindness, and her mysterious disappearance were woven into the very fabric of their lore. To hold something so intimately connected to her, to the Queen Lyra, felt almost sacrilegious. She watched him, her gaze fixed on the journal in his hands. It was an ordinary object, yet imbued with an extraordinary significance, a tangible link to a past that had shaped the formidable man beside her. The storm continued its furious assault, but within the confines of the rocking carriage, a new kind of silence had fallen, one heavy with the weight of untold history. The discovery was not just a relic, it was an echo, a whisper from a hidden legacy, now brought to light by the raw, untamed power of the mountains. Theron's fingers trembled slightly as he ran them over the faded leather, a world of buried emotions reflected in his usually unyielding eyes. He seemed to shrink, for a fleeting moment, from the imposing king to a boy holding a forgotten piece of his mother. Ilara remained still, respecting the profound intimacy of the moment. The storm outside raged on, oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding within the carriage, a storm of memory and revelation. The journal lay between them, a fragile bridge connecting disparate lives, disparate worlds, and a past long shrouded in mystery. Its presence felt less like an accident and more like a deliberate uncovering, a piece of the puzzle finally emerging from the shadows. Echoes of the past. The flickering lantern cast long, dancing shadows across the carriage's velvet interior as Theron carefully unclasped the journal. Its leather cover, intricately embossed with a forgotten crest, felt surprisingly supple beneath his calloused thumb. Ilara, perched on the edge of the opposite seat, watched him, a quiet anticipation building in the cramped space. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, providing a fittingly dramatic soundtrack to this unexpected revelation. Theron opened to a random page. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, softened as he began to read aloud, his voice a low rumble against the howling wind. March 12th. The weight of the crown feels heavier today than ever before. Another council meeting, another endless debate about tariffs and trade routes. Sometimes I long for the simple freedom of the gardens, for the scent of night-blooming jasmine instead of stale parchment. A small, surprised breath escaped Ilara. She'd always imagined queens as figures of unwavering composure, their lives a tapestry of privilege and power. To hear such a human longing, such a weariness, struck a chord within her. Theron turned a page, his brow furrowed in concentration. April 5th. My son Theron grows so quickly. He has his father's stoicism. Yet I see glimmers of a fierce, protective heart beneath the rigid exterior. I pray the burdens of kingship do not crush his spirit before he has a chance to truly live. His voice faltered slightly on his own name, a tremor Ilara almost missed. He cleared his throat, his gaze distant. She saw that, he murmured, more to himself than to Ilara. She saw the rigidity. Ilara felt a wave of empathy wash over her. It sounds like she saw a great deal, Your Majesty, she offered softly. Not just a king, but a son. Theron nodded slowly, then continued, his voice gaining a new, almost fragile quality. July 20th. The pressure to produce an heir is relentless. They see only a vessel, not a woman with her own dreams, her own quiet anxieties. There are days I feel like a jewel in a gilded cage, admired but never truly free. Is it selfish to wish for a life where my choices are my own, not dictated by the lineage I carry? He stopped reading, the journal resting open in his hands. The silence stretched, filled only by the tempest's fury. Ilara recognized the unspoken echo of her own life, the societal expectations that often overshadowed her personal desires. She, a simple peasant girl, felt the weight of her community's needs, the unspoken pressure to marry well, to secure her family's future. The scale was different, the gilded cage replaced by a muddy cottage, but the sensation of being bound by external forces resonated deeply. Theron finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers across the dim light. There was a vulnerability there she hadn't seen before, a raw honesty that peeled back layers of royal aloofness. She felt trapped, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Like I often do. Ilara's heart ached for him. She'd always imagined his life as one of absolute command, boundless freedom. To hear him confess to feeling trapped, to see the pain etched on his face, was a revelation. I understand that feeling, Your Majesty, she admitted, her voice low, though my cage is far less grand. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Theron's lips, a ghost of an expression. Perhaps the bars are made of different materials, Ilara, but the confinement feels much the same. He closed the journal, running a hand over its worn cover. She knew. She truly knew. The words were a quiet lament, a belated recognition of a shared struggle across the chasm of time and status. The storm raged on, but within the carriage, a different kind of calm had settled, born of shared understanding and the poignant echoes of a queen's secret heart. The promise of dawn. A sliver of pale grey light pierced through the condensation-streaked window of the royal carriage, painting a faint, ethereal glow on the dark velvet interior. It was a hesitant light, battling the lingering gloom, but it was there, a tangible herald of the dawn. The relentless drumming of the rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the wind, which had howled like a banshee through the night, was now a mere whisper against the sturdy frame. The world outside, so tempestuous only hours ago, seemed to be drawing a long, weary breath. Ilara stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet the soft, diffused light. The raw edges of her fare, honed to a fine point by the storm and the king's unexpected presence, had dulled to a quiet hum. Theron, too, had straightened from his slumped position, his gaze fixed on the nascent morning. The lines of tension around his mouth, etched deep by the night's ordeal and the weight of his mother's words, seemed to have softened, replaced by a contemplative stillness. The silence that followed the storm's cessation was profound, a stark contrast to the cacophony they had endured. It was the kind of silence that invited introspection, that allowed unspoken thoughts to unfurl. Ilara found herself tracing the intricate embroidery on the velvet seat beside her, a nervous habit she hadn't realized she'd picked up. "It's over," Theron murmured, his voice a low rumble, devoid of its usual authoritative edge. He wasn't speaking to her, not really. It was an observation, a release of breath held for far too long. He turned his head slowly, his eyes no longer shadowed by the dim light, catching hers. There was a vulnerability there she hadn't seen before, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared ordeal. "Yes," Ilara whispered, the word feeling fragile in the sudden calm. She felt a profound weariness settle into her bones. Not just physical, but emotional. The secrets they had uncovered, the raw truths laid bare in the darkness, had left an indelible mark. Theron cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to pull him back from the precipice of his thoughts. He reached for the journal, still clutched in his hand, and carefully closed it, reverently placing it on the seat between them. His gaze lingered on the worn leather cover for a moment longer before he met Ilara's eyes again. This time there was a different light in them, one of profound gratitude, tinged with something akin to respect. "Ilara," he began, and the sound of her name on his tongue, spoken with such uncharacteristic gentleness, sent a shiver down her spine. "You spoke of your desire to heal, to help your people. You spoke of the injustices, the lack of care." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I listened." Ilara's heart began to beat a little faster. She hadn't dared to hope that he had truly heard her, truly taken her words to heart amidst the chaos. "My mother," Theron continued, his voice laced with a newfound tenderness. She also longed for a world where everyone had a chance, where compassion was as valued as power. You reminded me of that, of her." He gestured vaguely to the journal. "You have a strength, Ilara, a kindness that I had forgotten existed in this world." He leaned forward slightly, his posture losing its rigid formality. "I promise you this, Ilara Meadowsweet. When we return to the capital, I will ensure that your path to becoming a healer is cleared. I will provide the resources, the training, whatever you need to achieve your dream." His voice was firm now, but not with command, rather with conviction. "And more than that, I will listen. I will listen to the needs of my people, truly listen, as my mother wished, and as you have shown me how." Ilara stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. The promise hung in the air, weighty and real. It wasn't just a king's decree. It felt like a personal vow, born from the crucible of their shared night. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. This man, who had been a terrifying, distant figure only hours ago, was now offering her the very key to her future. A faint, golden light began to filter through the windows, chasing away the last vestiges of night. The first rays of the true dawn painted the world outside in hues of rose and gold, revealing a landscape washed clean and vibrant. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound stillness, and with it, the quiet, unwavering promise of a new beginning. Discovered, the first rays of dawn, hesitant and pale, pierced through the still thick cloud cover, painting the sodden landscape in muted greys and greens. The wind, though calmer, still whispered through the skeletal trees, a mournful echo of the night's fury. Ilara, her eyes heavy-lidded but bright with an unfamiliar resolve, peered out the grimy window of the carriage. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world reborn, cleansed. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Beside her, Theron, his usually unyielding posture softened by the night's revelations, stretched, a low groan escaping his lips. The rigid lines of his face had eased, replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness that Ilara found strangely captivating. Suddenly, a distant shout ripped through the morning quiet. Ilara flinched, her newfound courage momentarily wavering. Theron, however, straightened, a flicker of his old sternness returning to his eyes. "Guards," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "They've found us." Footsteps grew closer, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the clatter of armor. A sense of dread tightened Ilara's chest. What would they think? A peasant girl, alone in the king's carriage? She instinctively drew back into the shadows of the plush interior, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your Majesty!" a voice boomed, close enough to make the carriage vibrate. "Are you unharmed?" Theron took a deep breath, a subtle shift in his demeanor signaling the return of the king. "I am well, Captain Kaelin," he called out, his voice resonating with an authority that had been absent for hours. "Open the door." Ilara's breath hitched. This was it, the moment of reckoning. She glanced at Theron, a silent plea in her eyes. He met her gaze, a fleeting, almost imperceptible nod of reassurance passing between them. The gesture, so small, yet so significant, quelled a fraction of her fear. The heavy latch scraped, and the carriage door swung inward with a groan, revealing Captain Kaelin, his face a mask of relief and grim determination. He was a man forged of iron and loyalty, his armor bearing the marks of countless battles. Behind him stood a half-dozen royal guards, their faces etched with worry, their weapons at the ready. Kaelin's eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over the carriage interior, relief morphing into a profound surprise. His gaze landed on Ilara, huddled in the corner, and his brow furrowed, a silent question forming on his lips. His jaw tightened, and his hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. "Your Majesty," Kaelin began, his voice laced with confusion, his eyes flicking between Theron and Ilara. Who is this woman?" His tone was wary, bordering on accusatory. The guards behind him shifted, their suspicions palpable. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She was an intruder, a mystery, a potential threat in their eyes. The soft, understanding gaze Theron had offered moments before seemed to vanish under the weight of his captain's scrutiny. Theron, however, held Kaelin's gaze, his own unwavering. He rose, his tall frame filling the doorway, casting a formidable shadow over the captain. He extended a hand to Ilara, an invitation, a silent declaration. "This," he said, his voice clear and resonant, "is Ilara Meadowsweet. She provided invaluable assistance during the storm." Ilara hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed her hand in his. His touch was firm, grounding. She allowed him to pull her gently from the carriage, stepping out into the damp morning air, the eyes of the royal guard fixed upon her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet Theron's hand remained clasped around hers, a silent shield against their judgment. The change in the king was evident even to Kaelin, who watched the interaction with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The stern, unapproachable monarch who had entered the storm was gone, replaced by a man who stood beside a peasant girl, her hand held firmly in his. The raw, untamed look in Theron's eyes, the subtle softening of his features, spoke volumes of a night that had clearly altered him, and by extension, the world around them. A new beginning. The crisp morning air, though still carrying the damp scent of the recent downpour, felt utterly new to Ilara. It wasn't just the chill that made her shiver, but the dizzying sensation of stepping into a world irrevocably altered. As she descended from the carriage, the solid ground beneath her felt both familiar and alien. Her worn boots, usually caked with the mud of the fields, now scuffed lightly on the flagstones of the royal courtyard. The watchful eyes of the guards, previously a source of immense intimidation, seemed to hold a different kind of curiosity today, no longer merely dismissive, but tinged with a nascent respect. She glanced back at the carriage, its polished black surface now reflecting the nascent sun. King Theron still sat within, his gaze steady on her, The public declaration, invaluable assistance, still echoed in her ears, a resonant hum that vibrated through her very bones. It was a shield, a promise, and a burden all at once. The hand he had held, her small, calloused one nestled within his firm grip, still tingled. It wasn't a romantic gesture. Not yet. Perhaps never. But it was an acknowledgement, a connection forged in the crucible of a shared storm and whispered truths. Theron finally emerged, his movements less stiff than they had been before, a subtle grace replacing his customary rigidness. He offered no further words of explanation to his retinue, merely a curt nod to Captain Kalin, whose brow remained furrowed in a mixture of relief and unspoken questions. The captain's eyes flickered to Alara, a speculative glint within their depths. The peasant girl, who had merely been a phantom thought hours ago, now stood undeniably at the king's side, albeit a respectful distance behind him. Alara. Theron's voice was low, for her ears alone, as they walked towards the keep's entrance. Are you... well? She met his gaze, no longer flinching from its intensity. I am, Your Majesty, better than I have any right to be. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. And you? A flicker of something undefinable crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps a touch of vulnerability. I am... rested. He paused, then added almost as an afterthought, and less alone than I was. The admission, so quiet and understated, resonated profoundly. It was an echo of the shared vulnerability, the intimate disclosures that had transformed a king and a peasant into two souls seeking solace from a storm, both external and internal. As they neared the massive oak doors of the keep, Alara felt a surge of exhilaration. The future, once a predictable tapestry of field and hearth, now stretched before her like an uncharted sea. She didn't know what lay ahead, whether her invaluable assistance would translate into a permanent role, or if this was merely a temporary reprieve before she returned to her village, forever changed by this extraordinary night. But for the first time in her life, the uncertainty didn't breed fear, but rather a thrilling sense of possibility. She thought of the Queen's journal, its delicate pages filled with a longing for understanding, a desire to be seen beyond the crown. She thought of Theron, stripped bare of his royal facade, revealing the man beneath, burdened, isolated, yet capable of profound empathy. And she thought of herself, Alara Meadowsweet, who had dared to speak truth to power, who had offered comfort where none was expected, and in doing so, had found a voice she never knew she possessed. The world outside the keep was still bustling with the aftermath of the storm. Fallen branches being cleared, puddles glinting in the burgeoning sunlight. But for Alara, the true storm had raged within the confines of that carriage, and its passing had left behind a landscape reborn. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her heart, that her life would never be the same. And perhaps, just perhaps, the king's wouldn't either. As the heavy doors swung open, revealing the gilded grandeur of the palace within, Alara stepped across the threshold, not as a frightened girl, but as a young woman filled with a quiet, audacious hope, ready to meet whatever new beginning awaited her.